So I've been gathering some really, really old back issues of late, and I wanted to share some rather fascinating insights into the mid 80s and toys with you that I've gleaned completely by accident because I was trying to pick up a specific range of issues of a particular title, and in doing so, I found out a lot more about the title and ended up getting far more issues than I actually needed to do what I wanted to do. But in doing so, I came to realise that there was a lot of advertising going on for toy ranges that I was and was not into. But it was so widespread that I thought you might be interested in having a look. And it's a nice bit of reminiscing as well. So let me start off with one of the earliest examples that I've got. Now, this is an issue of Secret Wars with old school Captain America on there. And you'll notice that along the top banner here, it says free inside Tomy Zoids comic strip pullout. And indeed there is a full-on comic-based advertisement for Zoids in here. And this was a long time before Zoids got their own comic, but it's very much in the style of their own comic. So this is a Toei tie-in. Interestingly, I've just noticed that this is part 2. So I wonder if this isn't perhaps the first element of it in the issue. But if it isn't, that might mean I need to get another Secret Wars issue. Brilliant. I also love these really sort of ancient classified ads for sort of ancient comic shops that may or may not still exist. Probably don't, I suspect, a lot of them. Future Shock, Odyssey 7, Nostalgia and Comics, Leeds Comic Mart. So yeah, it's just really... Oh, Forbidden Planet is still there. There we go, there's Forbidden Planet. The Forbidden Planet is still around. That's cool. So yeah, all these sort of... There's an Iceman strip there as well. So that's intrigued me now that it's said that that's the part 2, although it's really hard to read that because it's green against blue. But so basically we've got a Hellrunner and a Spider-Zoid, and just, this is very much with a view to selling the toys, of course, but it's in a Marvel comic before Zoids became a Marvel comic. So it's really interesting because obviously Tomy have bought space in this Marvel UK comic to put their Zoid strip in. But it's really well done. I mean, it's not cheaply done at all. The graphics look really good on it, and this is a theme which will continue. And I hadn't even noticed this before, actually. So on the back page of that, they've got a sort of a breakdown of a lot of the more common Zoids that you could get at that particular point in time. So that's a nice little bit of detail as well. And this is what fascinates me, because there was a lot of effort being put into these little tiny sort of comic inserts. So presumably the readership of these comics was such at the time that it was worth the toy company's while investing in doing these strips to act as a merchandising tool. But what's also fascinating is that it gives the writers quite a lot of scope, because once they've done their bit and they've represented the toys, they can kind of use it as a tool for their own storytelling after that, as long as it's not breaking anything in terms of what the toy companies are interested in. So it's always really sort of interesting to see where the creators go with this sort of stuff. So that was that one little example there, and that's quite early because that's September 85. So now Secret Wars then started featuring Zoids as a strip, so it was a sort of secondary strip for Secret Wars, and I'm going to do a separate video on the Zoids comics, because I think it's a really interesting story in the sense that it has some very interesting people working on them very, very early in their careers. Now here we have Spider-Man and Zoids, only the second issue. And interesting, this right on the front cover here, and this, I didn't get this with it, but a free Panini Transformers sticker album. Now, Transformers are not made by Tomy, and yet Zoids are all about Tomy. So the fact that you're getting Transformers advertised alongside Zoids on the front cover of the comic is really, really interesting to me, because it means that they were being Marvel were clearly quite keen to get the advertising revenue in off the back of it. and presumably either didn't need to clear it or did clear it with both the companies involved. So that's really interesting to me. And on top of that, we also have this. Now, I never had these toys, but I know of them. They were quite clever because, as you can see here, they actually involved sort of puppets. These are the sectors. And what you have here is a sectors cartoon strip, comic strip rather, sorry. And it's quite, again, it's quite detailed. This is classic sort of mid-80s graphics, but it's the storyline is there, and it's been quite well written. The characters look like the toys, but obviously it's bringing it to life, and that's the trick with these. It's if you can bring it to life in kids' imaginations, and they can act these things out with the toys that they then persuade their parents to get, of course. And it goes on for a while, and there were a number of issues with this in. So it's it wasn't just a sort of a one shot. This is an actual backup strip in Spider-Man and Zoids, which runs for a few issues. And here again on the back, you get another lovely example of the advertising of the era with Optimus Prime on the back. That's very old school sort of rendition of Prime. But the Transformers comic was running alongside this one. On sale every Saturday, so it was weekly in the UK, and they were both sort of cross-pollinating because this is the sort of the toys of the mid-80s were at their height at this particular point. Obviously because it's smack bang in the mid-80s, but the number of lines of toys that are actually running and still very current at that point is quite exceptional. So it's really fascinating how you can see the sort of cross-pollination. And of course there is no internet at this point, so how else are they going to advertise unless it's through what I imagine was quite expensive TV advertising? Comic advertising was probably a much cheaper option for them. And again, I was just casually flicking through the Spider-Man and Zoids ones, and we're into October 1986 now, and what should turn up but a Thundercats strip. Now, I knew that they'd done an annual for Thundercats, and fascinatingly, the script here is by Simon Furman, who of course is very, very well known for doing a lot of Transformers writing amongst many other comics. But this is Simon Furman, who also writes some of the Zoid storylines as well. And here we have a separate standalone Thundercats insert. Now this is very much along the lines of an advert. Interesting, it says it's copyright Telepictures Corporation and Ted Wolfe. So I've no idea. I suppose I've never really thought about who actually owned Thundercats, because it was its own sort of identity. But this is Snarf and Tiger and Lion-O and Chitara, all that good stuff. So it's the I think this is actually Snarf narrating here. He's not really, generally speaking, much use in battle, but it's a sort of full on strip, albeit a much shorter one than that, and that Sectors one that I was just showing you. But again, we've got the we've got a breakdown of the toys there as well. So again, another crossover, albeit a very short-lived one. Ironically, I was chuckling to myself because I've just bought a comic that was Transformers and Visionaries, and then I noticed that I had this rather rough copy of Transformers 158 from March '88, which has a bonus Visionaries mini comic inside, and it's Transformers in Action Force, which is the British version of G.I. Joe. So even now, in sort of March '88, we're a couple of years on from the Zoids comics. What we've got here is a comic where the Transformers are sort of co-heading with Action Force, just right out of the gates. So it's kind of not even an advert; it's a proper backup strip. We've got Action Force ads in here for the Sky Striker. This is another thing I love about these comics, is that you get these really great adverts for these ancient toys that people are now collecting for all their worth, and you see the original pricing in these is hilarious compared to what you now have to pay to get them. We've got Headmasters, And here we've got Visionaries. Now, see, Visionaries I had pegged as being later, but actually this is apparently read the further adventures of the Visionaries in the new exciting monthly Visionaries comic from Marvel, out March 24th, 88. So they're actually they're late 80s, but not quite as late as I thought they were. So this is a sort of starting point for Visionaries, which is what I thought I'd got in the original, the other comic that I got. But here you've got the breakdown of all the Visionaries toys. So I'll bring that a bit so you can see there. You've got the Auric, Witterquick, Arzon, Cryotech, Lexor, Darkstorm, Sindar, Kravex, and I had Sindar definitely, but I didn't have many of them. And there were vehicles as well. Hologram offers there, videos. I've got them on DVD actually somewhere. But again, just so a little comic advert there for Visionaries, but you've also then got this Action Force strip there as well. So it's just really sort of interesting how intertwined it all was at this point in time. And I'll this is the other Transformers single issue that I picked up as well, because this one is clearly Transformers and Visionaries. So now rather than Transformers Action Force, you've got Transformers and Visionaries. Now this is nearly a year later. In fact, it's almost exactly a year later. So now we've got Visionaries shifting up to be a secondary backup strip. We still got Action Force being advertised, mind. We've got Megatron kicking bottom. And here we've got Visionaries as a full strip this time, rather than just a sort of an advertisement insert. So I haven't read it properly yet, but again, it's just really sort of fascinating, just the sort of the sheer historical interest factor in terms of the toys and so on that were being advertised. Now, we go from that to then getting things like this. Now, this is slightly unusual for the UK. This is a monthly comic. This is a Centurions comic. Now, I wasn't looking for this. This is one of those classic instances where something just got sort of thrown at me by eBay, or sort of via eBay, one way or the other, and it's a Centurions monthly comic. Now, this is a classic toy tie-in because this is nothing but Centurions. I don't even know who published this. I haven't checked yet. So Kenneth Parker Toys Inc. Published and distributed by London Editions and Magazines. Yeah, LEM. I remember them because they used to do some 2000 AD reissues, I think, reprints. But when you can immediately see that this is not sort of your sort of massively high quality in terms of the artwork and everything else. But nevertheless, it is another example of sort of 80s comics being used to sell toy lines. And I don't know to what extent this was done in the States, because all the examples I have here are for toys that have been created by UK artists and UK writers. So I'm not quite clear on how much transatlantic crossover there was, because obviously some of the toy lines didn't necessarily translate to the US, or if they did, they might well have got their own sort of US comics. I mean, I've definitely seen, US versions of the Visionaries comic in the sort of actually in the US format. So I'm sure they did sort of flick around a bit, but this one clearly isn't a Marvel or a DC. So I imagine this is only. I mean, look at that. That's just it's not great, is it? I mean that of Skyvolt isn't a bad representation of Skyvolt. It's just that it just looks really sort of cheaply drawn, and no, with apologies to the artists if they're now better known, but it just looks like they didn't get anyone particularly renowned to do it. And it's it's interesting in so much as it exists, and it's another example of comics being used to do merchandising, because I just don't think that would happen in this day and age. I have seen Fortnite comics, but then Fortnite, of course, has sort of incorporated comics characters into its online storylines a lot. So it kind of makes sense that it would go backwards in that sense as well. That kind of works for me. I see why they would do that. And I have picked up Fortnite comics just out of interest to see what the modern tie-ins look like, because they do actually use them as part of their storyline, which is nice, because it means that you do get a little bit of sort of reason behind why you might get that sort of tie-in again. So I just wanted to share those with you, really, because it's just an interesting insight into how sort of advertising and merchandising was actually being used in those days. And why wouldn't they? Because it is, it's a great way to hit your sort of demographic market, I suppose, if that's sort of what you're aiming for. So yeah, I mean, it's I have been plotting behind the scenes to do a proper run through of Spider-Man and Zoids, because I think there's a lot of merit to what they did with Spider-Man and Zoids. They really sort of took it beyond what you might expect for a toy line tie-in, and it ran for a lot of issues. I mean, there are only 51 issues of Spider-Man and Zoids, but actually it started in Secret Wars. So really, it's nearer to 60 issues, all told, plus the annual, which I've already done a video on. And the annual comes about halfway through the run of Spider-Man and Zoids, and it does tie in, and it's referenced quite a few times, and even the text stories, rather nicely, are referenced in the comic as well. So I'm going to take you through that at some point, because what I also like about that comic is that, as with some of the ones I've just shown you, it's got a lot of backup stories which are quite interesting in and of themselves, in terms of being sort of either Marvel reprints or Marvel New Universe, or indeed there's actually even some Star Wars strips in with Spider-Man and Zoids. And you wouldn't think to look for Star Wars in Spider-Man and Zoids. I mean, it already sounds like a bizarre mashup, but it's just what they did. It's just what the Marvel UK imprint was doing at that point in time. I'm trying to think when they started doing things like Dragon's Claws and Death's Head, because they must have brought them in at about this time, but then they switched to doing them in the American style format, which is a brave thing to do at that point. So another thing I might try and do at some point is a bit of a sort of a timeline of when these things started coming in, because as I say, I think Visionaries was earlier than I thought it was. I actually thought it was a bit later, which is perhaps why I hadn't gotten as many toys of it. And it was probably just on the edge of my sort of, my toy buying kind of era. In fact, the era when I started moving into getting more comics. Comics, I think, for me, are really what kind of took over from toys in many respects. And yet a lot of the really sort of good comics that were about were actually originally based off toy lines. So it's a funny thing. It's a funny how these things kind of fed into each other. And also interesting that at this point in time, there wasn't a Zoids cartoon, but then when I first had access to Toonami, which would have been, I don't know, late 90s probably for me, all of a sudden there was a Zoids cartoon, but of course it was in no way similar to the Zoids comic that I was familiar with from the mid-80s. So that will be another sort of reference point for my sort of deeper dive into Spider-Man and Zoids comics and Zoids in general. So that's all I wanted to show you on these, because these are the only examples I've got. But if you can think of any other interesting crossovers that were happening around this time, obviously drop it in the comments, and do like and subscribe, and I will catch you for another one. Cheers for now.